So, Saul, or I'll talk about him as Paul, as we know him more familiarly. Paul was on a mission, clearly. He was on a campaign, a zealous effort to rid the faith of his youth, his inheritance, from the pernicious influence of those pesky Jesus followers known as the Way. He was on the road to Damascus. And two things happened simultaneously. The first one was that he was told he was wrong. Not just kind of wrong. Not just, you're kind of on the right track, but if you just tweaked your message or you worked on your presentation skills, you'd have it down. But really wrong. Completely wrong. The second thing that happened was he was told, get up and get going. There's work for you to do. You need to get up and get going and do it. Now, I don't know about you, but in those moments of my life when my valiant efforts, my great plans have been exposed to be failures, to be completely wrong, to be not what I was intending them to be, I'm not always so excited about getting up and moving forward with self-confidence. Okay, so maybe you've experienced this. I often feel shame, embarrassment, fear, regret. I want to go crawl in a hole and hope that nobody saw what I just did in a really exposing way. I want to go lick my wounds. I'm not really excited about getting up and going. Particularly if the mission that I'm supposed to go on is not clear. Particularly if I haven't been told what is going to come next. Well, and that is what is happening in this instance. As Paul is told, get up, get going, there's work for you to do, and you'll find out when you get there. And really, to be honest, Paul didn't actually really figure out his mission for a long time later. And maybe it was a good thing, because the mission that Paul actually got sent on was much, much more challenging than his self-defined work to rid Judaism of these early Jesus followers. The mission that he ended up being on was nothing short of introducing to the world to the grace and love and reconciling power of God. This mission that he went on put him at odds with everyone. Everyone. He was at odds with the Roman government because he started to say that Jesus was the Son of God, not Caesar, and that he began to talk to people and encourage them to, in a subversive way, to work to follow and to bring about the kingdom of God, not the kingdom of Caesar. So the Roman government, not super happy with him. He was at odds with Jews because Paul brought his message of God's love, God's acceptance, the possibility of being one with God. He brought them to a particular group, not necessarily the Jews in the center of the synagogue, but Gentiles that are known as God-fearers that were sort of around the Jews. So this was a group of people, mostly pagans, who were attracted to the Jewish religion. They were attracted to monotheism. They liked this idea of one God. They admired the Jews, but they weren't so interested in getting circumcised. They weren't so interested in all the purity laws. And so they hung around the Jews. They weren't exactly converts, but they hung around the Jews. They were called God-fearers. And they were super important to the Jews because they provided a buffer between the Jews and the Roman government. This was Paul's mission field. He went to those folks and said, you can be in. You can be in to the love of God. And he began to convert them to what became known as Christianity. So the Jews weren't happy with Paul. Even the other Jesus followers were not happy with Paul. Even his own people were not happy with Paul because of this exact thing. He was saying that, that all people can be part of God's covenant. That you don't need to become an Israelite. You don't need to become part of the historic laws of the Torah. That you can be part of God's grace. And so some of the other Jesus followers, They thought that he was preaching an easy gospel, that they really thought that you needed to do these things that had been part of their tradition since ancient times. And so Paul was hit on every front as he went about on his mission. Impossible mission. And yet, something about that encounter with Christ on the road made him know that salvation is not just for a small group of people. It's not just for one nation, one ethnicity. Salvation, the love of God, the grace of God is for the whole world. And thank God that's the message that Paul preached, the mission that he was on. Because really, I think that we have to credit Paul for this idea of grace, the grace of God, which for me personally is one of the most fundamental foundational pieces of my faith. Impossible mission. In a few months, a group of 16 of us will be going on a mission trip to Guatemala with Common Hope, for which we are selling tamales. Did you hear that? We're selling tamales after church. Common Hope, impossible mission, began simply enough in 1985 with two people from the Hubers from Minnesota, who their kids went to college, and they were deciding what to do with their time and their retirement. So they had a friend who invited them to come to Guatemala in the 80s and to help with education. So they started to do that. They went and did that. And as is true in Central America in the 80s, it was a dangerous place to be doing anything regarding social development, social service work. So pretty quickly, they were attracted attention. And one day in the late 80s, they were driving on their road, and some armed guards came and told them that they needed to leave the country and their lives would be in danger. So they packed up and they left. And the project that they had started at that point was called the God Parent Project. They were hooking up sponsors in the U.S. with kids in Guatemala to support them in education. They came back to Minnesota and they said, the God Parent Project is over. We can't do it anymore. Mission had failed, or at least it couldn't continue. Well, they went back to their lives, and there was something that was still tugging at them, work that was unfinished. So they began to explore more. They began to become increasingly more invested in Guatemala and to consider how broad that work actually is and to reconsider what it was that they wanted to do. And so they went back. They went back in the early 90s, but they did it differently. They realized that even though education, they really still believe, and Common Hope still at its core is an education ministry, because most adults in Guatemala, if they're lucky, they have a 6th grade education. And education, more than anything else, is the determiner to get out of the rampant poverty that's in Guatemala. Guatemala vies with Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. 50% of the people in Guatemala live below the national poverty line. 15% in extreme poverty. Education is really the key. But the reason why that only very, very few adults ever graduate from high school is because of all of the other issues that accompany a country that experienced a 36-year civil war. So, health. The malnutrition, poverty, the 27% of kids suffer from malnutrition. 40% of kids are below the average birth weight and birth height. Diseases that would be barely even considered diseases cause death or significant disability in Guatemala. So of course, if someone in your family is really sick, it's difficult for you or a family member to go to school. So Common Hope provides medical attention. They provide healthcare education. They provide nutrition counseling. They provide access to clinics. Social problems. 36-year civil war. Political corruption. Distrust, a lot for good reasons, of the government infrastructure, of the police. Alcoholism, abuse, domestic violence. Those are legacies of such a long history of civil war. those family situations make it very difficult for someone to be successful in school. So Common Hope provides family program, social workers that partner with families. It's not just a kid who goes to the Common Hope schools. An entire family gets enrolled. They get assigned to a social worker. The social worker meets with them, some planned visits, some unplanned visits, gives them education about gender issues, communication, how to work with changing roles for women. They have a big program for AA and Al-Anon because the alcoholism and drug abuse is in that country in significant ways. And I'm forgetting one more of their programs. All of this leads to their education ministry so that kids can be surrounded by this web, this network that supports them in graduating from high school. 11,000 people are touched through the partnership between folks in the U.S. and folks in Guatemala who work with the Common Hope program. Since 1996, they've graduated over 1,200 students from high school, and those students have a 56% higher chance to get out of breaking their cycle of poverty. Impossible mission that is fundamentally changing the material conditions of life in Guatemala, because people continued to move forward when their original plan wasn't exactly unfolding as they had hoped. Clearly, we do not need to go to other countries to be involved with impossible missions, with missions that God is involved with. We're doing one right now, Mission 401 Earth. Yesterday, there were how many of you were planting trees yesterday? It was great. There were over 30 of us from 2 years old to upper 80s, I think, planting about 9 trees. So we're on this mission, 401 Earth, planting trees, writing letters, making phone calls, going on the crop walk to address our care for the earth. Which, you know, to be honest, can feel like the most impossible mission of all. Climate change. I mean, you know all this, right? So there's this organization called 350.org that talks about how there currently are 392 parts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And 350 parts is what is actually safe for us to live on the planet. And so that's 40 parts, right? Over the amount. So we're already losing the battle. We already have lost. And what is currently in the stores of oil companies is more fuel. If we burn the fuel that we already have right now, it puts us way over the top. It feels like an impossible mission. The fossil fuel industry is probably the richest, most powerful industry in the world. It feels impossible. And yet, there is this motley group of environmental groups that are now being known as the fossil fuel resistance. They're not coordinated. They don't have a joint manifesto. They don't have one charismatic leader that is moving them into success. What it is a bunch of different groups who are working on different fronts. Students who are talking about divesting from oil companies. Churches like ours who are committed to planting trees, writing letters, doing advocacy. Organizations that stand with poor communities that say you cannot drill, you cannot take more coal from our areas and ruin our homes. That group is actually making a difference. They thought, the folks who were for the pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, thought that there'd be a little resistance and they would be well on their way in 2011. As we know, that's still not happened. Resistance after resistance after resistance. Impossible missions become possible when we move forward in faith, when we allow ourselves to step out even when we don't know the outcome. This is the work of God. The work of God is with impossible missions. Paul was on a mission. He was on a mission to tell the world that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. Not our identity, not our families, not our gender. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. And that love of God compels us to share that love with the world and with the earth. This is the season of Eastertide, the time when we are invited to step out on the road, to meet the resurrected Christ, to be willing to get up and try again if the road that we are on somehow didn't unfold in the way that we thought. This is the time to meet the resurrected Christ. May we have the courage to step out. Amen.